Hello everyone, welcome to John Redmann, Power of Attorney, the show that aims to empower you through knowledge of the law. I'm attorney John Redmann.
And hello everyone, I'm Shauna Sanford. Welcome to the show. Well, according to the recent headlines in the Advocate newspaper, New Orleans' murder rate is the lowest it has been in decades. The numbers are down 20%, and that's good news. But that also means that there are still many more happening throughout the metropolitan area. Well, during the next 2 weeks, we'll take a close look at how murder cases and others involving serious crimes are handled in the criminal justice system.
Our guest is attorney Julian Murray, Jr. He has extensive experience in the criminal justice system. As a former prosecutor, he has been voted one of the best attorneys in America for 30 years by his peers. So it's going to be a good show.
It is. He has a wealth of knowledge. We're both excited about talking to him. But before we get to our guest, if someone is accused of a serious crime, at what point should they contact an attorney?
You know, I don't do criminal defense work, but I can tell you this. God forbid any of us ends up in the wrong place at the wrong time and accused of a crime, or somebody screws up and they make a terrible decision and they commit a crime. Conventional wisdom says you want a criminal attorney as soon as possible. Contact one right away. Ask for an attorney if you've been arrested.
Okay, we have lots of questions for our guests, and I know he has lots of information to share. Coming up next, attorney Julian Murray, Jr. joins the show, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after this. Hello everyone and welcome back. You know, some of the most popular television shows are centered around murder investigations, but how realistic are they? If you're a fan and you're curious about what happens in real life, then you're in luck, because we'll be talking about that very subject with our guest today.
Mr. Julian R. Murray, Jr. joins the show today. Before he joined private practice, Mr. Murray worked in the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office and later worked as Chief of Criminal Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Louisiana. Julian, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this very interesting topic.
My pleasure.
Got a lot of ground to cover today, and we're talking about what's often called capital cases or very serious crime cases. Why don't we start by having you define what are capital cases?
Well, capital case means you can get the death penalty. In Louisiana, the only capital offense we have is first-degree murder.
Okay, and we want to go more broadly than that. In serious crime cases, how would you define serious crime cases?
I guess if you're the victim, they're all serious to you, but what we call serious crimes, you know, would be things like kidnapping, rape, of course, murder. We mentioned that. Things of that sort. Bank robberies, these are all very serious crimes and carry very heavy sentences.
And you mentioned murder, and we mentioned there in the intro that in New Orleans that the murder rate has dropped, the lowest in decades. It's dropped some 20%. What do you make of that?
Well, it's, I guess, good news, bad news. Yes, that's very good news that we have a drop like that. We're still, per capita, one of the highest homicide cities in the United States. But I attribute that to cooperation between the state government, the federal government, and the police department and district attorney's office. They're going after the gang-related crimes, and that's where most of the murders are coming from. And it's very good to see that type of progress being made.
And what about citizens, everyday people? Are they playing a part in that, do you think?
I think they are, and certainly should. In my particular civic association, Sheriff Newell Norman came and talked to us, and he said, we can't stop crime unless we get the cooperation of all of the people. If you find something that's suspicious, you let us know. Don't worry about whether or not it has to be a crime. If it's suspicious, let us know. And I had, on December 27th, I had a gunshot go off in my neighbor's yard. Now, being December 27th, I pretty much figured it probably was fireworks getting ready for New Year's Eve. But I called the sheriff's office and reported it because it's not up to me to make that determination. And if all citizens took that type of affirmative response to the crime problem, it would help a lot. And I think we're getting more into that, both in the cities and the metropolitan area.
And that's good advice for everybody. And for our show, we're gonna have you speak with us on this show and on next week's show about crime and criminal defense, and not just criminal defense. You, with your vast experience not only as a criminal defense lawyer, but as a prosecutor, both in the federal system and in the state system. You can give us insights in prosecuting crime. But it's good advice for our viewers that you don't need to make that decision. And if you think there's something going wrong that might be going wrong, please don't turn a blind eye.
That's correct.
Put in a call to 911, call the cops and say, I'm not sure if it's a crime or not, but the advice from the authorities is to call you guys, so I'm calling. And that's our neighborhood, and that's where we live. This is where we live. That's really good advice.
And one of the things that I'd like for both of you to comment on is that there could sometimes be a fear, though, of doing that, of getting involved. What would you say to the average person out there to sort of help put that fear in perspective in terms of keeping their community safe?
Well, you know, we do have Crime Stoppers, and that's anonymous, so you can report something to them without having to give your name. And also, if you call 911, they usually ask you, do you want to give us your name?
And you can say no.
And you can say no. But this is what I heard, this is what I saw, and so they don't make you give your name before they'll investigate it.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about prosecutors and defense attorneys. Help explain this, because as we're trying to better understand how murder cases and other cases involving serious crimes are handled, we need to have an understanding of the roles that the folks who are involved play. And you've been on both sides.
Yes, I have.
So help us understand how this all plays out.
Well, it's all part of our criminal justice system, and it can't work without both sides coming together. I don't mean agreeing, because sometimes you're fighting vigorously against the other side, but you have to understand that the system works when you have honest, fair, vigorous prosecutors, and you have honest, fair, vigorous defense attorneys representing their client. That's how the system works. I know some people say, you know, well, I don't like criminal defense attorneys. And I say to them, go live in a country where they don't have any, and pretty soon you'll gain respect for them. That's our Constitution, and that's the way that it's supported. Thomas Jefferson said that I believe that trial by jury is the only anchor ever yet imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its Constitution. And that's the fact. You put the jurors in between there, and the state with all of its power comes in, and the defense attorney representing the individual comes in, and that jury is what keeps the balance in our system.
And what is the burden that each side has to bear when it comes to these trials?
Well, in criminal cases, the prosecutor has to prove his case beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a high burden. In a civil case, it's just more probable than not. But in a criminal case, it's a much higher burden, because we believe in the principle that it's better that 10 guilty men go free than that one innocent person be convicted. And so that's why we have that higher burden of proof.
Yeah, there's some critics out there who say, well, I don't think 10 guilty people should go free and one innocent, rather than one innocent be convicted. The response to them is, as long as you're not you're not the innocent person going to jail, I'm sure you don't have a problem with it. But I wanted to follow up on that comment. The idea is, in a free society, and America is that example to the rest of the world. Sometimes, because we're human, the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time can be accused of something that he or she didn't do. And our Constitution gives everybody that presumption of innocence, right?
Yes.
And it's the defense attorney's sacred responsibility. It's a big responsibility on your shoulders when you're doing your job as a defense attorney, to make sure that the state doesn't just put somebody away for life or send them to their death because it looks like he did it. He probably did it. Everything points to the fact that he did it, but he's just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So your job as a defense attorney to make sure that the state dots their I's, crosses their T's, and does everything properly before, God forbid, that innocent man goes to jail for something he didn't do or she didn't do.
That's correct, and that's part of the system. You're representing the individual, and that's very, very important, but you're also representing the system, and the system only works when both sides are in there doing their job and doing it properly. And that's why the prosecutor can hit strong blows, but not foul blows. And if that happens, then the system most of the time works.
You have been practicing law for a very long time, and I know lots of our viewers who are watching are very familiar with you. A lot of folks are probably very familiar with a very high-profile case in which you were the defense attorney, and that's for former NOPD officer David Warren. Talk a little bit about that, because this was one of the biggest cases that happened after Hurricane Katrina.
Yes, and yes, I, together with Rick Simmons, we both were volunteer attorneys in that. Some of the questionnaires came to the jurors saying, "What do you like? Why don't you like criminal defense lawyers?" So, well, they just do it to get the money. And Rick and I fought for 3.5 years to get him free without being paid. So sometimes you just fight for the system. But that was a very interesting case, and it had a lot of lessons regarding the practice of criminal law. In my opinion, not the least of which was the question of statute of limitations. How old does the case get to be where you can still prosecute it? This case was brought within the statute of limitations, but just barely.
Well, tell everybody what the statute of limitations is.
Well,
What does
it's
that mean?
you can't prosecute a person in Louisiana. It's 6 years for a felony. No statute of limitations on murder, but 6 years for most felonies, 4 years for some. In the federal system, it's 5 years statute of limitations, and it's put in there.
If the state wants to go after somebody, if they wait too long to prosecute, then the case becomes too old and it's too late, and then they can't prosecute.
That's correct.
Okay.
And just for people who don't know all the details, just very briefly, he shot Henry Glover. This was right in the height of what was going on immediately after Hurricane Katrina. That was never disputed.
That's correct.
That was never disputed. Mr. Glover did die, and so this is where we are with the case. This is what the case is about.
The state said that, prosecuted him and said that he murdered him. That was the state's position. And the defense of the case, which you were involved in, and the defense was what?
Justifiable homicide. Afterwards, there was an issue of whether or not this was a homicide. They wanted the coroner to say it was a homicide. There was no question about that. It's a question whether it was justifiable homicide, given all the totality of circumstances following Katrina. But
very interesting point that you bring up there about homicide, whether it's justifiable or not justifiable. We have to take a quick break. We're coming up right on the end of this segment. So let us take this quick break, and when we get back, we're going to get into that. Plus, we're going to get your questions for our guests. So stay tuned. We'll be back right after this. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Well, all week long, we've been getting your questions about serious criminal cases, and we're going to answer them in just a moment with our guest today, attorney Julian Murray, Jr. But we were talking about the David Warren case, big case, and we were talking about homicide. In this case, you argued that it was a justifiable homicide.
that's correct.
Yes, explain.
Yeah,
that.
homicide is one person killing another person. Murder is someone killing another person illegally. So there is such a thing as justifiable homicide, and that's what the issue was in this particular case. And that takes in the totality of circumstances, which included all of the ramifications that were going on after Katrina.
And one of the things that made this case such a hot button issue, and what made it so inflammatory, was there was a gigantic cover-up that other police officers got involved in, where the young man who died, other officers engaged in taking the body, trying to hide it, put it in a car, burn the car, and obviously there were other officers who were not justified, it was determined, in engaging in this cover-up, and your client had, that police officer, he had nothing to do with that, is what your position was.
Well, that's what the Court of Appeals said, too, that he should not have been tried together with them, because all of these things, it's hard for a jury to separate those out. I would just point out, because the case is still going on in the courts, that the testimony was that regarding the burning of the body had nothing to do with a cover-up. At the time that was done, no one knew that the person had been shot by a police officer.
Okay.
And the officer that did that had been working, saving lives and going over all of the dead bodies, corrupting bodies, and then he got transferred over to Algiers where it was dry, and the first thing he runs across is a dead body. and he's told by his supervisor to put the body over on the levee. And the idea of it being corrupted was more than he could handle. And it's post-traumatic stress disorder. He just went through a terrible ordeal, and that's why he burned the body. He had no idea that it had been shot by a policeman.
Okay.
And that case is still going on. That's the only reason I paused to
Right.
Still going
comment on
on.
it.
Okay.
Right. And before we get to the questions, I have to ask, because you said there were so many lessons that came out of that. If there was one lesson or maybe two lessons that the public could glean from that, because I know emotions were high on both sides during that trial, what would that lesson be that you would hope that people would pull from this case?
Well, first of all, we talked about the statute of limitations. The older a case gets, the more memories fade and get confused, and the likelihood of someone remembering all of the facts correctly diminishes in direct relationship to the amount of time that goes by. I didn't even start investigating this thing till 3.5 years after the
it
event.
happened.
And then people's memories start to fade. In fact, the officer Linda Howard, who was a main witness for the government, and by the way, it was not the state, but it was the federal government that brought this case in the Civil Rights Act. She kept talking about flashbacks that she had because she just suppressed all of the memories until 3.5 years later when she started to be questioned about it. And so the statute of limitations is very important in a system of justice. Memories do fade and do get confused. So the likelihood of the conviction being secure in that much time is very remote.
Is it different for different types of cases?
Yes,
It
yes,
is.
it is.
Okay.
Yeah, and especially when the bar is very high, because the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt. If there's any reasonable doubt that the person is guilty, then the jury's instructed to not convict of that charge, correct?
That's correct. And it has to be unanimous in the federal system. In fact, in almost all states. Louisiana is one of 2 states where certain felonies you can convict with a 10-2.
That means 10 jurors out of 12 is all that's required instead of 12 jurors out of 12.
That's correct. We went on 2 states that do that, and it's being challenged regularly, and it might get to the Supreme Court one day. But yeah, unanimous juries are much better. Then you got a pretty strong sense of
Before you lock
security.
somebody up, then you're really, really sure they're guilty.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. We're going to go to our questions. First one comes from Lewis, and he says, can anybody accused of a crime receive a public defender?
No, it's for indigents. In fact, they call it Indigent Defender Board because it's for people that don't have the money to hire attorneys that have them appointed for them. But nobody in this American system gets convicted without having an attorney. And that's the Gideon versus Wainwright case. And the Supreme Court said you have to have an attorney. So if you can't afford one will be appointed for you.
And you have to prove that you can't afford one? Is it relatively...
It's not hard to do. You put on the oath, and you have to swear on the oath about what assets you have and what you don't have. And then the court makes a determination as to whether or not you qualify for an appointed attorney.
Okay. All right. Our next one comes from Nadine, and she says, how many murder cases in New Orleans are gang-related? You actually talked about this a little bit ago.
Well, I can't give an exact figure, of course, but most of them are. In fact, the killing at the parade, that we thought just 2 people were involved in, it turns out just in the newspaper this week that was drug-related. Nobody thought that at the time. They just thought 2 crazy people shooting, but it turns out that was drug-related. So I do think a large percentage of the cases are gang-related, and the gangs most always are drug gangs.
Okay. Our next one comes from Rooster. Okay, we got a Rooster here. Can you explain the death penalty and life imprisonment?
That's a good question.
Yeah, very good question.
It's a discretionary call for the most part. The prosecutor, first of all, has to determine whether or not he or she thinks it's important enough that to go for the death penalty. It's very hard to get the death penalty. It's very expensive for the state to pursue that. But if the prosecutor decides that this case qualifies for death penalty, then you have to go to the grand jury. Citizens sit on that grand jury and determine whether or not you can even charge someone with a capital offense. But if the grand jury determines that you can do it, and by the way, grand jury means grand only in the sense of numbers. In the federal system, it takes 23. It's a grand jury because it's larger than a petite jury, a petty jury, which is only 12.
Okay.
But in the state, Louisiana, we have 12 on the grand jury and 12 on the petty jury.
Really?
So it's the same
really?
number.
Oh, okay, it's the same number here. Okay.
But the citizens have to determine. And you might remember the case of Dr. Poe. who stayed after Katrina, and,
Yes.
and they wanted to prosecute her, and they took it to the grand jury, and the grand jury said, no, you can't go forward with this prosecution. So it's the people standing between the power of the state and the rights of individuals, both at the grand jury level and the petty jury level.
How often does that happen, though, that grand jury does not return an
Very
indictment?
seldom. Most of the time, the grand jurors only hear one side of the case. So if the
Right.
prosecutor wants to prosecute someone,
Right.
they put on certain evidence, and that evidence only has to be probable cause. It doesn't have to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So for the most part, the grand jurors indict the ones that the prosecutor wants to indict. But in the special cases, that's what they're all there for. And Dr. Poe's case was a special case.
Right, right. Okay, so when it comes to the death penalty versus life imprisonment, you were saying the grand jury, that involves, a death penalty case would involve a grand jury.
That's correct.
Is that right?
That's correct. And of course, even in Louisiana, the petty jury has to be unanimous. It has to come out without, we believe that this was intentionally done, premeditated. That means before, meditate, thinks about it. So it has to be a crime that you've thought about, you've planned to do it. So it has to be premeditated, specific intent to kill, and that's a high burden. And most of the time, the death penalty cases are specific victims. For example, if it's a child under 12, if it's an adult over 65, it can go for a death penalty. If it's a law enforcement officer involved, you can go for the death penalty. And by the way, if it's even a chemist who works on cases, then they're protected if you kill someone like that. If it's a witness to a case and that person's killed, then you can go for the death penalty.
Let's change the discussion. I mean, same question, death penalty, life imprisonment. There's been a lot of debate about, and I know that it's debated over the years whether or not the death penalty actually is more expensive if the district attorney, if the prosecution is successful in going and getting the death penalty. I think some people think if you get the death penalty, then they're not going to be stuck in jail for a long time. They're just going to, we'll execute them, and then won't cost the state any more money. What can you comment about that?
Well, it's not true. It costs a lot more money for the taxpayers to get the death penalty against someone than to keep them in jail for the rest of their lives. It's a very...
That's amazing.
Well, you have to understand, we as a society take a lot of respect for life. And if you take a life away from someone, there are a whole lot of steps you have to go through there. So it's not just a trial, it's not just the appeal, then you have the post-conviction attacks on it. Was there effective assistance of counsel? Did we find out that the prosecutor withheld evidence? All of these things are looked at afterwards. So the litigation goes on and on. And so if you think that somebody withheld evidence in the prosecution team, then you get a new trial, and that gets appealed, and so it goes on and on. So, I represented Len Davis, the policeman that got the death penalty.
Right.
And that was years ago, and it's still going on. He's still alive. And it cost a tremendous amount of money. You have experts, you have attorneys that are appointed, and so it's more money to kill somebody than keep them in jail for the rest of their life.
It does not happen quickly, and someone could be on death row for a very, very long time.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and what you just mentioned, I mean, shouldn't it be that way? Shouldn't you have to go through all of those steps before you end someone's life?
Yes. I mean,
Well, let's talk about the Innocence Project. That's a good reason right there, right?
that's correct.
Explain what that is.
Well, the Innocent Project, headed up by Emily Moore, a great attorney, they go for people who have been convicted and in fact are innocent. And we've seen more and more of that coming to fruition because of DNA. DNA, you can go back for years and years and find out, wait a minute, this person's been in jail for 23 years and in fact is innocent. But it's not limited to that. There's sometimes people just recant, said, yeah, I testified that he did it, but in fact, I lied. And there are cases like that years later, people believe, well, if someone confesses, they obviously are guilty. That's not true. There are a number of false confessions, the pressure that people are under when they're being questioned about a serious matter, they quite often just to get out from under the pressure say, yeah, I did it.
You know, that's such an interesting topic, and believe it or not, we are at the end of the show, but we have a second show. So we're going to explore that topic just a little bit more, so stick around for that one. This is all the time that we have for this episode, but don't worry, because the conversation continues next week, so be sure to join us again.
Thanks so much to Julian Murray Jr., and thanks to all of you for watching. Remember to send in those questions via Facebook, Twitter, and email, and go to johnredmondpoa.com to watch past episodes and to get more information. Thanks, and we will see you next time on John Redmann, Power of Attorney.